Chapter 1. A Happy Child with a Bright Future. Oskar Schindler is the hero of this story, but nothing in his early life suggested that he would become a great, even a noble man. Oskar was born on the 28th of April 1908 in the industrial town of Zwickau, now Zwickau, where his family had lived since the beginning of the 16th century. In Oskar's childhood, this region was known as Sudetenland and was part of the Austrian Empire ruled by Franz Joseph. After the First World War, it became part of Czechoslovakia and later the Czech Republic. Oskar's parents were great supporters of Franz Joseph and proud to be Sudeten Germans. They spoke German at home and at their jobs, and their children went to German-speaking schools. Few people in this quiet corner of Czechoslovakia objected to the way of life that the Schindlers and other Sudeten Germans had chosen for themselves. Zwickau was a small industrial city surrounded by hills and forests. Oskar's father, Hans Schindler, owned a factory which made farm machinery and employed about 45 people. Oskar studied engineering in secondary school with the idea that one day he would run the factory for his father. Herr Schindler was a big, sociable man. He enjoyed fine wine and good tobacco and liked to spend his evenings in coffee houses where the conversation was clever and amusing. He was the kind of man who could drive a wife to religion, and Frau Luisa Schindler practiced her Roman Catholic faith with energy and sincerity. It worried her that her son stayed away from church as much as his father did. In later years, Oskar and his sister Elfriede remembered a childhood filled with sunshine. They lived in a modern house with a big garden and enjoyed being the children of a successful businessman. Oskar had an early passion for cars and began building his own motorbike as a teenager. Some of the students at Oskar's German secondary school were from middle-class Jewish families and had fathers who were also successful businessmen. In fact, a liberal Jewish rabbi and his family lived next door to the Schindlers. Rabbi Cantor was a modern, intellectual man, proud to be both a German and a Jew, and always ready to enjoy a friendly debate about religion or politics with Herr Schindler. His sons went to school with Oskar and Elfriede, and the four children ran and played between the two gardens. The Cantor boys were bright students, perhaps intelligent enough to become lecturers at the German University of Prague one day. But this dream changed in the mid-30s. Rabbi Cantor had to admit that the Nazi Party would never permit a Jew to teach at a university or to succeed as a scientist or businessman. There was certainly no type of rabbi that was acceptable to this new government either. In 1936, the Cantor family moved to Belgium, and the Schindlers never heard of them again. History and politics meant little to Oskar as a teenager. His enthusiasm was centered around fast motorbikes, and his father encouraged this interest. In Oskar's last year at school, Hans Schindler bought his son an Italian motorbike. Then, in the middle of 1928, at the beginning of Oskar's sweetest and most innocent summer, he appeared in the town square on a Moto Guzzi, an amazing motorbike usually owned only by professional racers. For 3 months, Oskar forgot about his studies and his future and entered professional motorbike races. He did very well and loved every exciting minute of this life. In his final race in the hills on the German border, Oskar was competing against the best riders in Europe. He kept close to the leaders throughout the race and just failed to win. Even though people said he could become a champion racer, Oskar decided to end his motorbike career after that thrilling afternoon. The reason may have been economic, because by hurrying into marriage with a farmer's daughter that summer, Oskar lost the approval of his father, who was also his employer. The elder Schindler could see that Oskar was similar to him, and he worried that his son was marrying a girl like his own mother, a girl who was quiet, graceful, and religious, but not very suitable for the sociable, charming, and handsome Oskar. The bride's father, a wealthy widower, was as unhappy about the marriage as Hans Schindler was. He was a gentleman farmer who had expected Emily, his daughter, to do better than to marry a boy on a motorbike with no money of his own. The bride, according to the custom of the time, agreed to bring a large sum of money into the marriage. Most of this money was never paid, however, because Emily's father did not believe that Oskar would settle down and be a good husband to his only child. Emily, on the other hand, was delighted to leave her small village and her father's old-fashioned household, where she had to act as hostess to him and his boring friends. She was enthusiastic about moving into an apartment in Zwittau with her tall, handsome young husband. However, Emily's dream of a happy marriage did not last long. Oskar followed his father's example and forgot about his wife in the evenings, staying in cafes like a single man, talking to girls who were neither religious nor quiet. Hans Schindler's business went bankrupt in 1935, and soon afterwards he left his wife and found an apartment on his own. Oskar hated his father for abandoning his mother and refused to speak to him. The son seemed blind to the fact that his treatment of Emily was already following the same pattern. Meanwhile, even though the world's economy was suffering, Oskar managed to get a good job. He had good business contacts. He had a background in engineering, and he was good company. These qualities made him the perfect man to become the sales manager of Moravian Electrotechnik. He began traveling a lot, which reminded him of his time as a motorbike racer, and which gave him an excuse to stay away from his responsibilities in Zwittau. By the time of his mother's funeral in the late 1930s, Oskar, like many young Czech Germans, was wearing a swastika, the badge of the Nazi Party, on the collar of his suit. He was still not interested in politics, but Oskar was a salesman. When he went into the office of a German company manager wearing the swastika, he got the orders that he wanted. Oskar was a busy, successful salesman, but he could feel something even more exciting than money in the air. In 1938, in the month before the German army entered Sudetenland and made it part of the Third Reich, Oskar sensed that history was being made, and he wanted to be part of the action. But just as quickly as he had become disappointed in marriage, Oskar became disappointed with the Nazi Party. When German soldiers captured Sudetenland, Oskar was shocked by their rough treatment of the Czech population and the seizing of property. By March of 1939, he had quietly turned away from the party. Oskar was not ready to reject Hitler's grand plans completely at this time. In 1939, it was still not clear what kind of men would lead Germany forward. One evening that autumn, at a party near the Polish border, the hostess, a client and friend, introduced Oskar to a sociable, clever German named Eberhard Gebauer. The two men talked about business and the political situation in Europe. After several glasses of wine, Gebauer explained that he worked for German military intelligence and asked Oskar if he could help them in Poland. With his charm and contacts, Oskar would be a useful agent for collecting military and industrial information for the German government. Oskar agreed to the proposal for two reasons. First, it meant that he would not have to serve in the army, and second, he almost certainly approved of Germany's plan to seize Poland. He believed in Hitler's goals, as he understood them at that time, but he still hoped that there would be civilized ways to achieve them. He hoped that decent men like Gebauer, not men like Himmler and the SS, would guide Germany. Oskar was praised in the following months for his useful and thorough reports. He was good at persuading people to talk to him over a fine dinner with an expensive bottle of wine or two. As he did this work and continued as a salesman, Oskar also discovered that Krakow, the ancient center of cultural life in Poland, offered many possibilities to an ambitious young businessman. Chapter 2. War brings troubles and opportunities. Germany invaded Poland from the west on the 1st of September 1939. The USSR invaded Poland from the east on the 17th of September. The Second World War had begun. By the 7th week of German rule, the inhabitants of Krakow were struggling to make sense of the orders that arrived daily from the authorities in Berlin. Poles had to exist on the rations allowed to them. They had to do whatever jobs they were given. But the Jews of Poland, who represented 1 in every 11 of the population, began to realize that their situation was particularly dangerous. Already they had to declare their Jewish origins and carry Jewish identity cards. As subhumans, as the Germans insultingly called them, they received only half of the official rations given to non-Jewish Poles. The German administration insisted that all Jews must register with the appropriate government office by the 24th of November of that year. In this environment, it was obviously wise for a Jew to be careful of what he said and did. One Polish Jew who understood what was happening better than most people in Krakow was Itzhak Stern, chief accountant at J.C. Buchheister and Company, and an expert on Jewish law and religious texts. One day in October, his new German bosses called him into the director's office as usual. They understood very little about the factory they were now running and relied on Stern to guide them. The thin, intellectual Jew entered the big office and was introduced to Oskar Schindler and Ingrid, a beautiful young Sudeten German who had recently become the manager of a Jewish tool factory. They were an elegant, stylish couple, full of confidence and clearly in love with one another. They would go far under this new system.
"Herr Schindler," the German director said, "this is Itzhak Stern. He understands this factory and can also help you with information about other local industries."
According to the rules of the day, Stern said,
"I have to tell you, sir, that I am a Jew."
"Well," Schindler confessed with a smile,
"I'm a German, so let's talk business."
"It's easy for you to be friendly," thought the accountant, "but I must still live by your rules." Nevertheless, Stern understood history and trusted that even though conditions would probably get worse, the Jews would survive in Poland. As a race, they had learned how to deal with foreign rulers over many centuries. And anyway, young businessmen like Oskar Schindler still needed people with experience, whether they were Jews or not. When Stern was alone with Oskar and Ingrid, Oskar began the conversation.
"I would be grateful if you could tell me about some of the local businesses."
"With respect, Herr Schindler," said Stern, "perhaps you should speak to the German officials who are now in charge of business in Krakow." Schindler laughed and said, "They're thieves and rule-makers. I don't like having to follow a lot of rules." So Stern and the young industrialist began to talk. Stern had friends or relatives in every factory in Krakow and understood how the economy worked. Schindler was impressed and finally asked the question he had come to ask. "What do you know about a company called Record?"
"It went bankrupt before the Germans arrived. It made enamelware, but was badly managed," Stern reported.
"I have the financial statements for the company's last 5 years in business. Can you give me your opinion of them?" asked Schindler, as one businessman to another. Stern looked carefully at this friendly German. Like many Jews, he had the gift of knowing in his bones who was a good non-Jew. He began to sense that it might be important to be connected with Oskar Schindler. He might be able to offer a kind of safety.
"It's a good business," Stern continued. "And with the kind of machinery it has, there's the possibility of military contracts."
"Exactly," Schindler replied. The German government is looking for Polish factories that can produce army equipment. Pots, dishes, and spoons for the soldiers. With my background, I understand the kind of company we're talking about. Stern sensed that he could be honest with the young German. I can help you with the legal work. You should rent the property with the option to buy. Then, more quietly, he added, there will be rules about who you can employ. Schindler laughed. How do you know so much about the authorities' intentions? We are still permitted to read German newspapers, said Stern. Actually, he had read documents from the German government that he had seen on the desks of his new bosses. He knew that one of the aims of the Third Reich was to get rid of all Jewish owners, then all Jewish bosses, and finally all Jewish workers. As the two men left the office, Schindler became philosophical and began talking about the fact that Christianity had its roots in Judaism. Maybe he was reminded of his boyhood friends, the Cantor brothers. Stern had written articles about religion in serious journals and quickly realized that Oscar's knowledge of religion and philosophy was not very deep, but that his feelings were sincere. A friendship began to form between the two men. Towards the end of their conversation, Oscar said, "In times like these, it must be difficult for a priest to tell people that their Father in heaven cares about the death of every little bird. I'd hate to be a priest today when a human life doesn't have the value of a packet of cigarettes." "You are right, Herr Schindler," said Stern. "The story you are referring to from the Bible can be summarized by a line from the Talmud, which says that he who saves the life of one man saves the entire world." Of course, answered the German. Rightly or wrongly, Itzhak Stern always believed that these words from the Talmud guided Oskar Schindler throughout the next 5 years. Schindler met Itzhak Stern by accident because he kept his eyes and ears open for people who might be useful to him. He met another Krakow Jew, Leopold Pfefferberg, by chance too. Like other important Germans in the Polish city in 1939, Oskar had been given a fine apartment by the German housing authorities. It had previously been owned by a Jewish family by the name of Nussbaum, who the authorities had ordered to move out without paying them for the apartment or its furniture. Years later, several of Oskar's friends from the war claimed that he searched Krakow for the Nussbaum family in 1939 and gave them enough money to escape to Yugoslavia. This kind of generous behavior was typical of Schindler. In fact, some people said that being generous became a disease in him. A disease because he was always in danger of dying from it. Back in 1939, Oskar liked his big new apartment very much, but he wanted to decorate it in a more modern style. He heard that Mrs. Mina Pfefferberg was the best interior decorator in Krakow, so he went to see her. Mrs. Pfefferberg and her husband were still living in their own apartment, but they feared a visit from the Gestapo, announcing that the Pfefferberg home now belonged to a German army officer or businessman. In fact, their apartment was taken from them by the Gestapo before the end of 1939. When Mrs. Pfefferberg heard a knock one morning in October, looked through a crack and saw a tall, well-dressed German with a swastika pinned to his suit, she thought that day had arrived. She looked at her 27-year-old son, Leopold, with alarm in her eyes. "Mother, don't worry. The man is not wearing a Gestapo uniform. He's probably looking for me," said Leopold calmly. He had been an officer in the Polish army until their defeat in September, and after he had been captured, managed to avoid being sent to Germany. Perhaps the Germans had found him now. Recently, he had been surviving by buying and selling on the black market, because he had not been allowed to return to his real job as a physical education teacher. In fact, Jewish schools were closed soon after this time.
"Answer the door, mother," whispered Leopold. "I'll hide in the kitchen and hear what he wants. If he makes trouble for you, I've got my gun."
Mrs. Pfefferberg nervously opened the door. "You're Mrs. Pfefferberg?" the German asked. "You were recommended to me by Herr Nussbaum. I have just taken over an apartment near here and would like to have it redecorated." Mrs. Pfefferberg could not manage a reply, even though the German was speaking politely. Leopold stepped into the room and spoke for her. "Please, come in, sir." "Thank you. I am Oskar Schindler. My wife will be coming here from Czechoslovakia," he explained, "and I'd like to have my new apartment ready for her." With her strong, healthy son beside her, Mrs. Pfefferberg relaxed and began to talk to Schindler as a client, discussing fabrics and colours and costs. After it was settled that Mrs. Pfefferberg would do the work, Oskar turned to Leopold and said, "Could you visit me at my apartment one day and discuss other business matters? Maybe you could tell me how to get local products when the shops are empty. For example, where would a man find such an elegant blue shirt as yours?" Leopold knew that this man wanted more than a good blue shirt. His business sense told him that he could make some profitable deals with this customer. He answered, "Herr Schindler, these shirts are hard to find, and they're extremely expensive. But give me your size, and I'll see what I can do." Oskar expected to be charged a very high price for the shirts, but he was sure that this Jew would be useful to him. In fact, Leopold became one of Oskar's most reliable sources of black market luxuries, and as the years passed, those luxuries kept Oskar in business time after time. By December of 1939, it had become clear that the Germans would not be leaving Krakow very soon. But Oskar, and even many Polish Jews, continued to hope that the situation would be better in the spring. After all, the Jews told themselves, Germany is a civilized nation. Through his contacts in the German police and military, Oskar heard troubling rumors. He learnt that the SS would carry out their first Aktion in a Jewish suburb of Krakow on the 4th of December. He went to the Buchheister offices and dropped hints for Stern. But this was the first Aktion, and few believed it would happen. The SS plan was to carry the war against the Jews from door to door. They broke into apartments and emptied desks and wardrobes. They took rings off fingers and watches out of pockets. A girl who would not give up her fur coat had her arm broken. A boy who wanted to keep his skis was shot. There were worse events occurring in other parts of the city, being carried out by a group of German soldiers with special duties, known as the Einsatz Group. From the beginning of the war, they had understood that Hitler's plan meant the extinction of the Jewish race, and they were willing to take extreme steps to achieve this goal.